All right, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for showing up. This is my first webinar doing this kind of thing, so hopefully this works out and we can do more of these types of presentations in the future. To give you a really quick overview of what this is all about, a bunch of forest and climate groups over the past many months have been working in concert together on various projects, but the one I want to highlight today is the messaging guide that just came out yesterday. It's a guide that seeks to synthesize the latest science about how forests and climate change interact. And it's mostly about wildfire, but it does contain other important messages about forest carbon, water, habitat, all that kind of good stuff. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly suggest checking it out. Today's webinar will be kind of giving an overview of some of that content. Dr. Dominick DellaSala, who's with the Geos Institute down in Ashland, is going to go over Wildfire 201. It's probably not going to be a 101, but a little bit more info. It's going to be quick though, probably 10 to 12 minutes, or hopefully it will be. I will be giving a quick overview of forest carbon. It will be a 10-minute presentation as well. And then Ralph Bloemers with Crag Law Center in Portland is going to be giving us a 10 to 12-minute presentation about the wildfire messaging guide. He'll highlight some of the resources that are in the guide and the associated toolkit, and talk about some upcoming projects down the road. Once again, feel free to chat me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will turn this over to Dom. You can share your screen, Dominic, and I'll unmute you.
Okay, everyone hear me okay? Alex?
Sound good?
All right, got to blow through a lot of material pretty fast. And I'm not going to be on the call for the entire period because I have a blues guitar lesson coming up and I can't miss it because hopefully my second career. Anyway, I wanted to just kind of stick together some of the pieces that are in the messaging guide as it pertains to wildfire, carbon, and forest, and how they're integral to a cogent defense against climate change, and how they can all work together. Most of the presentation wildfire, but I'm also going to go into the importance of forest carbon, both in fire dependent systems and in wet forest.
All right, so we're on slide 3 now, which is biodiversity begets biodiversity. And as mentioned, when an ecologist looks at that slide, we get really excited because we see variety, and variety in nature is the spice of life. So this biodiversity is associated with high levels of biodiversity. As you will see in the next slide, which shows a very diverse community that's associated with the snag forest. We refer to it as nature's phoenix. This is not a catastrophe when a fire comes through and kills most of the trees, but it's a restart, a reset by nature. And a whole unique community comes in to colonize these snag forests that are exceptionally rare and because of post-fire logging, and are as biodiverse as an old growth forest. The next slide is slide 5. It shows how the green forest and the blackened forest are part of a successional sequence that's linked through time. And you can't have a forest without the dead trees. So this is part of the process that happens after a fire. And the next slide is slide number 6. And in it, I talk about what governs the behavior of these mixed severity fires and how that's changing. Notice the arrows on the right. And so fire is governed by top-down drivers like climate, and bottom-up processes like topography and fuel. And it's no accident that the thickness of those arrows is different. As the climate changes, the top-down climate driver will influence fire behavior more than any other factor. And this is an issue that is definitely relevant to fuel treatment, because fuel treatment works from the bottom up. And when you have a top-down driver of fire behavior, fuel becomes less important as the climate shifts. Slide number 7 is an interesting relationship with how fire activity relates to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This is what governs our weather systems off the Pacific coast. During warm cycles, like in the early 1900s, lots of fire activity. And then there was a cool down in the middle of the century when fire suppression was becoming militarized and very effective. And this was the same time when a lot of homes were being built in the so-called wildland urban interface. Look what's going on since the 1980s. This is the warm cycle again, and it's related to climate change. As you can see, over half the recent increases in acres burned are due to a warming cycle that we're in. And the next slide is slide 8. It shows climate change driving the temperatures and wildfire activity in our region. You can see the different effects of climate change, which is affecting and feedbacking on forests, making them more primed to burn in certain places. So a big question that comes up in slide 9 is, when you see a fire like this, how much emissions are going into the atmosphere? And I was part of the Oregon Global Warming Commission's 2018 report to the legislature on wildfire emissions. And you can see that the average annual fire emissions are only about 10 or 11% of the total state emissions. And most years it's a lot less. And in fact, the emissions coming from logging are much greater than the emissions coming from all the state's wildfires. The next slide, number 10, shows the problem with creating fire unsafe landscapes that are also climate unsafe. These types of so-called active management result in emissions to the atmosphere that far exceed those from wildfires. And in this slide, number 11, shows the relationship between active management and uncharacteristically severe fires. So what we have here is the histogram bar in red are private lands, and the amount of high severity fire burning on private lands compared to protected areas, which are much lower. And so we see a lot more uncharacteristic burning in the kind of landscape that you see in the backdrop. And that's especially deadly when combined with extreme fire weather, which is where we're headed in much of the region because of climate change. This slide 12 is on thinning, and this comes up a lot. And if you look at the data on thinning effects and wildfire behavior, only about 1% of more than 7 million acres that have been thinned in the last few decades actually encounter a fire. So the odds are less than 1 in 100 that these sites will get hit by a lightning strike. And instead, a lot of carbon is going into the atmosphere from this kind of logging, and instead of wildfires. This slide, number 13, shows the association between wildfire ignitions and human populations. And so the more population, the more roads you have in the area, the more fire ignition. So a lot of these fires, in fact, over 80%, are caused by humans that are triggering the types of big fires that we see in many places around the country, with the red colors being higher numbers of wildfires associated with more and more development. So the best way to deal with this is in slide 14, which is this fire security approach through defensible space management. If you do everything on this slide here, the odds of the home surviving a fire go way up to 95 or so in 100, a lot better than 1 in 100 odds of thinning. This slide, number 15, is a really tough one. I've met with a number of politicians about this that are convinced that thinning is going to stop the smoke and the fires. It's not going to happen. This is the inconvenient truth about climate change. We cannot stop smoke by thinning in our region. And, you know, we could talk a little bit more about that in Q&A, but there are ways that we can effectively plan for more smoke as depicted in the slide. So here's the wrap. Forests in general are nature's swamp coolers and water towers. So they sequester and store carbon. They give us water. All of these values are going to be exceptionally important in a changing climate. This slide, number 17, shows where forest carbon is mostly concentrated in the United States. And we're arguing that these forests, which are the mature forests that have a lot of carbon, should be protected as the US commitments to the Paris Climate Accord. And so hopefully in the next administration, we can move in that direction and start to secure the benefits that you see on the slide. The Sierra Club, for instance, is in the process of launching a new campaign aimed at a national carbon trust that would protect these carbon dense areas. And in closing, my final slide shows the overall picture. So a national carbon trust would be compatible with keeping dinosaur carbon in the ground and atmospheric carbon in the forest, and fire is not a constraint on that. If you do that, you get biodiversity and all those ecosystem services. You also have to lower the stress on those ecosystems so they can adapt, connect them to each other through connectivity, and increase the rotation ages on private lands. So that's kind of the full picture. I'm going to stop there and apologize for the technology problems, and I'm turning it back over to Alex.
Thanks, Dom. So since you have to go to your blues guitar lesson in 10 or 15 minutes, I think we should move the Q&A for Dominick's presentation to right now. So if we have two folks on the line who want to ask a question about fire, please speak up now, or you can raise your hand through chat and I can ask your question for you if you don't want to speak in front of everyone.
Oh,
Yeah,
I think I finally figured out
this
the mute system. This is Steve Homer. So Dominick, how would the forest for the Carbon Trust be identified? Is this like the wet west side forest that we're talking about in the Tongass, or are there more than that?
It's more than that, Steve. Thanks for asking that question. We initially used a threshold value derived from the Pacific Northwest and extrapolated that to all forests across the US and concentrating mostly on the wet forest. I think we need to redo it using regionally specific thresholds. If we can get some more funding, we're going to redo those maps so that every forest in the country can be involved.
Thanks.
I'll jump in too. Hi, Dominick. This is Amy Moss. I wanted to talk more about smoke. It's a big hot topic that seems to be a big focus, and that's not really addressed by the defensible space answer to a lot of this. So I'm just wondering if there is any connection between forest management and smoke. Is there anything that communities can do other than opening up some of these safe spaces during smoke events?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Great question. And I just had a beer with a couple of legislators down here last night about this. And the inconvenient truth is because the scale that smoke affects our region is so large, it's really hard to affect it on a local level. For instance, last year in the Rogue Basin, and all the way up to Portland for that matter, the region was impacted by smoke coming from 500 fires burning in British Columbia. So while you might be able to reduce the probability of a fire at a specific site, recognizing the odds are really low, you still have regional influences and a changing climate that is causing a lot of the fire behavior changes that we see now. So I think the best approach is smoke shelters, is to improve air quality overall so that there are less particulates in the air when we do get a fire, and just prepare for it. It's almost like trying to stop a hurricane in the Southeast or a flood in New Orleans. It's just a part of the climate signal that we're seeing in our region right now. And unfortunately, trying to affect it at a local or regional scale when the influences are global is just not going to work.
If I could jump in, there is one forest management issue I have seen that has bearing on this, which is brush disposal. It's really critically important that if there is thinning work going on around communities, that the brush piles get dealt with, because they can become a source of serious ignitions. I was in the Black Hills a couple of years ago, and that forest was littered with brush piles. And so, you know, they're basically setting themselves up for a problem. So if there is going to be all this management, it needs to be done properly.
Can folks see my screen all right? Everyone's muted, so. Dominic, can you see my screen?
Affirmative.
Okay. I feel like a dictator. I've taken control of everyone's audio.
You're good, Alex. We can see it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to go just as quick as Dominic just did through the forest carbon piece. And Dominic touched on this, so I'll skip those parts that he highlighted. I have been working on forest carbon the last several years. I first started doing forest carbon work for the Sierra Club. And the last few years, I worked for Oregon Wild on a variety of topics, but forest carbon issues were one of those topics. These days, I work with Cascadia Wildlands to help communicate the science behind forest carbon and wildfire. So the messaging guide that just came out and this webinar, these are some of the projects I'm working on to get the word out, and we'll have other kinds of presentations and webinars down the road. So stay tuned for that. Here's what I'm gonna hit in the next 10 minutes. I'm gonna go over the science of forest carbon and how trees sequester carbon, how logging emits carbon. I will highlight opportunities with state and private timberlands to store more carbon than they do. And I'll conclude by talking about national forests and other public lands. Before I dive into the science, though, I think it's really important to highlight the context. Last year, the IPCC report woke a lot of people up because it gave us a short period of time to influence the amount of excess carbon in the atmosphere. And the scientists were emphatic that not only do we need to aggressively limit fossil fuel emissions, we also need to increase the amount of carbon stored in forests. And the reason that forests are so important is because cutting fossil fuel emissions is not enough. Last month, NASA averaged the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. It's 412. That's about 45% more carbon than was in the atmosphere before industrial activities. About 50%. So we're at 150% now, in other words. That is leading to increased temperatures worldwide. This last week, Europe has been hit by an insane heat wave that has had huge impacts throughout the continent and even into Eurasia. June was the hottest June on record. That's given the averages that we've had over the last 100 years. And it looks like, according to NASA, it looks like July, this month, is going to be the hottest July on record. To put it bluntly, we need to do everything we can to reduce the amount of excess carbon in the atmosphere. And fossil fuels are the #1 priority, and they should be. And I want to make one caveat to everything I'm about to say. We cannot pretend like taking action on forest carbon issues can be a substitute in any way for the action that's required on fossil fuels. We need both in concert to draw down emissions to a level that actually stabilizes the climate. I hope that's very clear. So with that context, let's go through some of the basic science. Carbon is the building block of life on Earth. Plants acquire carbon through photosynthesis. They use the sun's energy to break down CO2 and water to form glycose, which is their energy source. It's what they use to operate. And these fuels, I'm not going to get into all the basics, all the fundamentals, but there's 6 excess carbon molecules that are eventually stored in the plant's organism. And that is, those carbon molecules are stored until the plant eventually dies and decays. At that point, that decay process emits the carbon back into the atmosphere, and the cycle goes on. In a forest, trees are the vast majority of the carbon that's stored on the landscape. About half of a tree's weight is water, and when the tree dries out, about half of the dry weight is carbon. And if you want to see this represented more visually, check out how much carbon is stored as a forest gets older and older. You have the stand age represented down here at the bottom. And notice this green section. That is all the live tree biomass, the forest carbon that is being stored by the living trees. I want to highlight this orange section. These are all the dead, fallen, and standing trees on the forest floor and in the forest. Very significant portion of the forest carbon. The understory is this small blue line, and the forest floor here is this gray. Let me just reemphasize how important forests, how important snags are to forest carbon. These are, this is a cedar snag here on the right, which is probably 50, 70 years old. These trees can stay around for over 100 years after they've already died. You can notice this one has a burn scar. On the left, this is a high severity fire that burned years ago, and these snags remain for decades and sometimes even centuries. That carbon stays in the bole, the trunk of a tree, for a very long time. So dead trees are cool too. It's not just the living trees. Unfortunately, due to management activities in the West, the majority of Western forests have been subjected to very aggressive forms of forest management. Here in the Pacific Northwest, where I think most of us are located, we are very familiar with the phenomenon of the clear cut. These kinds of management activities have transferred vast amounts of carbon from forested landscapes into the atmosphere. To understand this basic concept of the transfer of forest carbon, I want to go through some of the rhetoric that industry uses in talking about forest carbon. You'll see, now that I've pointed this out, you'll see these ads and you'll see this on billboards throughout Oregon and Washington because industry has caught on that people care about climate change and they want to co-opt the issue to pretend like cutting down forests is a way to act on climate. Their narrative is actually it's a pretty fun narrative. I wish it were true. That we need to clean up dead and dying forests. We need to cut forests before they burn, before these trees die and decay, because if they burn, all that carbon is lost Instead, we need to cut the forests and store the carbon in wood products, in homes and in chairs and desks and whatnot. It's a pretty logical narrative, right? It kind of has a certain kind of logic to it that is appealing in a way. Unfortunately, it's not founded in scientific fact at all. And I'm just going to run through some of the science that refutes that that narrative. So wildfires, according to numerous studies, only emit 5 to 10% of the carbon that's stored in the forest. In other words, the vast majority of a forest carbon stays stored after a fire. On the other hand, the vast majority of a forest carbon is released when it's subjected to industrial logging. And here's a breakdown of where some of that carbon goes. A lot of the carbon is lost on site when the treetops and the limbs and the needles and the roots and all of that are left to decompose. Sometimes they're burned on site as slash piles. Then it gets to the mill, where further reductions in carbon take place. The tree is whittled down into 2x4s and other wood products. If you factor in transportation, as these studies did, you only have 15% of the original carbon stored in the tree that ends up in the wood products. A lot of folks will have a counter argument to that, and they'll say, sure, most of the carbon is lost when you make wood products, but then you replant trees, right? So you sequester all that carbon again. Once again, let's go to the science. According to estimates by the Forest Service and researchers at institutions around the Northwest, a typical Western Oregon old growth forest stores 323 tons of carbon per acre, 323. A typical clear cut or plantation in Western Oregon stores 113 tons of carbon per acre. That number is the average of all industrial private lands in Western Oregon, and that's according to the Forest Service. The difference between the two, and this is this red area here, is what scientists call carbon debt. It's what we have transferred from the forest to the atmosphere by converting these native forests into plantations. We can begin to repay that debt through climate smart forest practices. So now I'm going to quickly run through state and private issues and then conclude with public lands. This is a very familiar sight throughout, especially Western Oregon. Where I live in Washington, forest management practices are slightly better, but I want to remind Oregonians that there are a lot of problems in Washington too. You can see here, this is the valley where I live, just outside of Bellingham. I live just off on the banks of the Nooksack River. And these are mostly state lands owned by the state of Washington that are managed almost exclusively for timber production. There are some private lands here too, but you can see that modern forestry releases a lot of carbon. We can begin to lower these emissions by instituting better practices on these lands. The simplest is let trees grow longer before cutting. This is a good example of how you can store more carbon by waiting for longer periods. Instead of harvesting trees every 40 years, you wait maybe 60, 80, 100 years before harvesting. You can also store more carbon by expanding buffers around streams and rivers. This is a photo by Francis, who's on the call, of industrial private timberland in Oregon. Stream buffers are sometimes quite a joke in Western Oregon. And we can definitely expand those and have major carbon benefits. And the last thing I'll highlight here is logging according to FSC standards. Forest Stewardship Council, there are a set of management practices to get this certification that are not perfect, but they are a significant improvement over the status quo model of forestry in Western Oregon. The idea is to produce wood products and leave a forest behind rather than completely nuking a landscape and leaving nothing behind. One thing I'll highlight is this would not only result in better carbon storage on the landscape. It would also result in making our communities more resilient to climate change. It would do a really great job at protecting our watersheds and making sure we have clean water year round. It could buffer our communities against flooding and the extreme storms that will come from climate change. And it moderates fire severity. There's a lot of science out there that shows that industrial plantations burn at higher severity than native forests. Okay, that's a lot, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm quickly going to run through public lands. Here in federal public lands. Here in Washington, these green areas are the federal lands. This much prettier map produced by Oregon Wild shows the federal lands highlighted in green. You can see Crater Lake National Park, that brown spot. These public lands belong to all of us, and the intact forest lands on those public federal lands are powerhouses at storing vast amounts of carbon for long periods of time. But the carbon benefits of having these lands disappear when we industrially manage them. There's no better way to explain this point than showing this map, also produced by Oregon Wild. This is the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which was designated just 6 months ago. It's on the Oregon Coast Range. It's the largest swath of old growth left on the Coast Range. Notice the purple line that shows where the wilderness area is. The surrounding white carbon desert that you see is the private industrial forest lands. The darker the green on this map, the more carbon stored. So it's very clear where the old growth is and where the plantations and clear cuts are. According to the Forest Service, we are only storing about 63% of our total carbon storage capacity on the national forest lands in Oregon and Washington. That's because of the way that these lands have been degraded through aggressive logging practices over decades. In the 90s, there was a major shift in forest management in the Northwest, known as the Northwest Forest Plan. And I won't get into the specifics, but that management improvement led to dramatic benefits from the forest carbon perspective, even though that wasn't an intention of the plan. To put that into, to give you kind of a ballpark understanding of what kind of carbon we're talking about, that's 7 million megagrams of carbon per year. So in other words, 24% of the carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion in Oregon and Washington. That's the amount of carbon every year that is being sucked up and stored by our forests just because of the management changes we made in the 90s. Imagine what we could do if we had a forest management policy about storing more carbon on the landscape. Think of all the carbon benefits that we could find if we were to actually manage for carbon. 4 solutions I'll highlight before concluding. We protect our old growth, cut logging on public lands in half, defend our bedrock environmental laws, and require management agencies to account for carbon, we can see dramatic improvements in how much carbon is stored on the landscape. I think our forests can be a major player in the fight against climate change, and I think it's time to enlist our forests in that fight. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Ralph is there are so many other values of these forests beyond forest carbon. Most important to me, the wildlife habitat on these lands. There are so many species out there that depend on these lands as their lifeblood. And by protecting these forests for forest carbon, we can also protect these lands for all of the other species that live on the landscape. All right, sorry that was so quick. That was a lot of information. This is being recorded, so you can go through those slides again if you'd like. There will be a Q&A in a minute, but we are going to turn it over to Ralph. So Ralph, if you can unmute your line, you should go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay, so it's not supposed to, I'm supposed to take 10 minutes. I'm going to try to hit that. And I guess I would just say on this messaging guide, a lot of you folks that are on this call know these issues really well. And the idea behind it is for us to take collectively the knowledge that we have and the things that we've attempted. And at least my idea was for us to try to really examine what we've done to try to communicate about these issues, both to the people that support our organizations and beyond those people to the general population, and really try to take all that great knowledge and experimentation that we've done and experiment some more and try to capture it in a way that's useful, not just for forest groups that for the most part get this and that we're pretty consistent on it, and we could do better on that, but to bring along the climate community and to make a resource that we could sort of internally publicize through the Climate Advocacy Lab, which some of you all might be members of, and through other sources to give people some of the tools and also just give them some of the infographics that you started to see and imagery and other things that they can use to communicate around this challenging issue. So for those of you that don't know me or that do know me but haven't caught up with me in a while, I've been working on these issues for like 18 years as a litigator in courts and in the field with scientists on post-fire logging projects, and in the courtroom and advocating for wilderness and challenging state forest logging and or defending the state's decisions not to log as much as industry would like, whatever it might be. But with the Eagle Creek fire in 2017, I decided to kind of really dig in and try some stuff. And by showing you these slides, I'm going to really touch on what's in the guide, which is this message of try to deliver what we're talking about in plain terms. In other words, don't lead as much with science and facts, be grounded in that, but use imagery and use more plain language. For example, say animal instead of species. For example, that might not, that's not necessarily been social science research, but these are things we've tried, a lot of us have tried, and in ways to try to reach more people about these challenging issues. So, we see these big fires and they're very emotional. And so when we talk about talking fire with empathy, I think Brenna Bell has said it best, is that, we want to meet people in their lived experience, which is choking on smoke and being fearful that their home will burn down. And so just trying to tell them that fire is natural and fire is beneficial doesn't work because of their lived experience and because it runs headlong into the dominant cultural beliefs that have been ingrained in them through Smokey the Bear, and just because it's such a powerful elemental force. So how do you get around that? Well, we got up into the air after the Eagle Creek fire to kind of look at what it looks like and show that. So that's the sort of show things to people and try to tell them less what to think. Let them reach the conclusion. So I spent a lot of time in the burn landscapes with time-lapse cameras at the suggestion of a friend of mine who's a National Geographic filmmaker. We did a bunch of time-lapse and got permission to be in various parts of the gorge. I also did a lot of trail work and, spent time trying to talk to people. And, there was a lot of mourning about the fire. There was a lot of sadness and a lot of belief that everything was destroyed. So it was a great opportunity to show people that it wasn't destroyed. And part of that was through trail rebuilding and other community type service projects allowed me to get into the burned area or, other hikes. And Brenna and I spent time with Cascade Lock's kids. I think this is part of, and some examples that aren't provided in the guide, but this is kind of what we mean, the collective, we mean by talking fire with empathy, which means more listening and more showing and less telling. These are the kids that I mentioned in Cascade Locks who lived through a fire and were evacuated. And we spent a lot of time listening to them, but we also took them out into the forest, and that was really a great experience for them and allowed them to heal from the trauma of fire. There's the ferns popping out of the ground, and then right when Alex told me that I hadn't shared my screen yet, I was here, which is a 16 months time lapse. And this is really sort of the nuts of show, don't tell. And one of the things that I've found is hardest to communicate is that fire is natural, fire is beneficial. As Dominic said, fire is nature's phoenix. Well, people are like, well, so you're telling me to go light more fires? Of course not. But, what the way to reach people on that, I think, is to show them the forest comes back, that these systems, are wonderful because they are disturbed and because they are wild and untamed, and that they are longer than our lifetimes. And a nice way to do that is to kind of show some of that. So of course, fire has been part of these systems for millennia. But when we see this big smoke, we wonder what's happening. When we see these big flames, we wonder if there's more fire than ever before. Well, Dominick called it inconvenient truth. I like to say, you know, we're delivering hope and hard truths. And you can kind of see that throughout the document that we created, the guide that we created. What's the hope? Well, we don't have more fire than ever before, but we could. So there's a paradox in there, except if we look at some of these newer charts that we made, this is in the toolkit, you can see nationwide, you know, we see this overlap with a warm, dry climate period and cool, wet with less fire, and then we have global climate change. These are nationwide figures. But if we look, you know, are we having more fire than ever before? You know, if we look at the Eagle Creek fire, it was 50,000 acres, whereas the Yakult burn was about 230,000 acres. So I think the hard truth is that we can't promise people less fire, and we cannot promise people less smoke. And we really try to be honest with that in the guide. Here's, you know, this piece about the weather's big influence on fire, the cool, wet climate period, and it doesn't really show a big pop on the global climate change side in terms of more fire, except when we go to the next slide, which is if we just look at it from 1975 to now, which is most people's lived experience, right? A number of people on this call were probably not born until late 90s or even their, you know, late 90s. As my son now says, that was back in the 19s, which makes me feel really old, the 1900s. So, you know, it really depends on what period you're looking at. And I think what is the challenge with this information, which we tried to wrestle with in the guide, is that fire suppression got a helping hand from a cool, wet climate period. So that means we can't rely on fire suppression as much, right? Or global climate change is driving higher levels of fire if we look just in the Western US on this chart. And so it's really mostly drought and wind. It's not a question of how we manipulate the fuels. And I think what Dominick showed reinforced that. So we kind of have to look at each one of these different charts and try to think about what we're trying to talk to our audience about and why. And these will be in there, and you all will have to wrestle with that. We didn't intend to provide all the answers about how you might use this, nor do we pretend to think collectively that the document has all the answers. It is an attempt to experiment with some new creative stuff to try to wrestle with these. Now, again, fire is beneficial. Forests are adapted to fire. Forests recover. Wildlife thrive. Super hard for people to take in just because of the dominant cultural beliefs that we have been taught for so long. But these historic images, which I have many of, and I've spent a lot of time to collect, really show, you know, high severity fire and then old growth forests again, right here in our backyard in the Mount Hood National Forest. And people love these images. They make them feel hope. Showing them these kinds of images from near the rim fire and within the rim fire that Trip Jennings took of the great gray owl. They love them. Showing aerial footages of the recovery. To me, this seems like one of the best ways to talk about fire as natural, fire as beneficial, by showing these things to them. And that's from that original Wildfire book that many of you are familiar with. So let's see. What else we can share with you about the guide is, you know, moving into this, the solutions part. I'm just going to get to that. Is the biggest question and biggest, I think, impediment, in addition to the smoke question, which was touched on, is home safety. The biggest impediment to us accepting more fire on the landscape, allowing more prescribed fire, is the home safety question. And the answer is there, as Dominick has indicated. We are working on a number of things to try to bring that to life. I highly recommend, you know, reading up on the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety and looking at some of those citations and listening to the Built to Burn podcast, and Jack Cohen, Alexandra Seifert, and the insurance industry in some counties, like in California, are requiring homes to be retrofitted. Oregon is looking into making it mandatory for all new homes, and they do have a code for that they just adopted, but it hasn't been adopted statewide. Those are solutions that can get communities to a safe place. So that is a very hopeful message. This works. It's a one-time thing. You don't have to come in multiple times. And so the guide really tries to emphasize that, but the resources and the imagery in support of that is also very deep. And so the guide is kind of the tip of the iceberg. That's the Built to Burn podcast. If you're not familiar with it, it's on it's on the web and you can find it easily. And if you can't, you can let me know. So one of the things we hear from industry is that management will get us there. One of the things proposed for a variety of reasons, but often for fire risk reduction purposes, is thinning. Now, of course, it doesn't make any sense to oppose thinning defensible space within and around homes, but far in the backcountry, there's always been a lot of debate in our community. But you know, what's interesting about that is for two reasons. One, the one that Alex highlighted on carbon, and the other one is, does it work reason. We really tried to wrestle with this in the guide, and we tried to wrestle with this in the form of this graph, which Dominick had a version of, okay? So one of the hardest things to show to people, and Alex and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make this work, is probabilities, okay? People look at this circle and they look at the little circles and they read the stuff and it just doesn't really come through. That it's really challenging because we don't know where fires will burn and in any given year. And we have such a vast landscape to go out there and thin some forest to affect fire behavior before it grows back. But that's scientists have figured out the probabilities are the 1%, and you've heard that. So we took this and we turned it into that. And Alex worked with a designer and I helped with that to sort of show 350 trees as 350 million acres. You know, we could have randomly scattered these trees, the annual burn forest throughout this, because they're not even symmetrically going to show up on one side. And the fuel treatments aren't going to be all lined up. You can see that little yellow top of the one tree is the 1% that is encountered. Now, what we're trying to do with this kind of graph is it's not intended to be this marketing cutesy thing. It's really supposed to respect the viewer, the consumer, and it's supposed to, you know, show that the presenter has a lot of respect and knows his or her stuff. So this is our first attempt to do it. We used the metaphor in the top is a shot in the dark. You could use needle in the haystack. We could certainly provide the source files if you wanted to change the title. And certainly if you had other ideas about how to continue to improve this, whether it's little things like the contrast, we're very much open to that and don't pretend again to have all the best answers on this. This is our attempt. Now, one of the things that's talked about in the guide is supporting native fire use. Well, native fire use has been part of our landscape for millennia. Certainly didn't impact as much land as logging has, but it did impact the land and it has its benefits. This is a Margot Robbins from the Karuk, and some of those images appear in the guide. This one does here. And we have some footage and we're working on a film that includes some of their work. But I think this is an important piece because it's really an equity issue, and it's also about restoring fire to the land and changing cultural beliefs around fire. So I think it's a very powerful thing for us to advocate for. It's something that's already happening and that we need to see more of, and that's one of the solutions in the guide. Now, Smokey is a little bit getting in on the act, but not much, kind of part of the problem and also maybe part of the solution. So it's always fun to pull out this image. People love it, they laugh. It's very provocative because they think of Smokey as the fire prevention bear, not as the fire starting bear. So it's a good one to sort of take people out of what they think and challenge them a bit. Now, at the end of the guide, I would just highlight, and I have this image, you know, there's a lot of terminology, and all of us are very familiar with those terminologies. Some terms are scientific, some are euphemistic. The guide, for the most part, tries to be very grounded in the science and the facts, but then sometimes we're breaking down some of the euphemistic terminology, and that's kind of less for you all that already know this stuff and more for people that this isn't their world, so that they can kind of get the straight dirt on these terms. And then at the very end, you can see there's all the citations and linked throughout the guide, backlinked, so you can read supporting science and dig into anything further. I think that's pretty much it. I'll leave it at that and just say, you know, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot already in that guide, and we aim to provide and continue to develop a lot more.
Thanks, Ralph. So Brenna just asked if y'all can get the PDFs of some of those infographics that Ralph was just showing. I just sent in the chat bar here on the side the link to our Wildfire Comms Toolkit. It includes numerous resources, but there is a folder of these graphics. The graphics are intentionally unbranded so that all of you can use these graphics in your emails and in your own communications with your base. Feel free to ask us any questions you might have, but there are graphics for you to use there, and we're going to be developing more graphics down the road.
Yeah, and the 3 of those that I showed were not in there yet, so I'll put them in there today.
Great. Okay, so with that, I would love to now hear from all of you, and you can turn your videos on because I would love to see some of your faces. What questions do you have? Comments, ideas? Please speak up. And the last part of this meeting is to hear from all of you, so go for it.
Hi, Alex. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me or anything.
Yep.
I'm here as MC.
Go for it.
First of all, just want to say, Ralph and Alex, great work. That was awesome. I'm so excited about this guide. I had just a quick question on a little bit about the forest carbon aspect, and a lot of that seemed pretty focused on like your area, like Washington and Oregon and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if more work is coming or if there's going to be more information available that's a little bit more either centered around California or stuff down in maybe like the southwestern United States. Just because a couple of the offices I'm working with right now had some questions. And also the second question to follow up on that is this something that is this messaging guide something we want to keep for at least right now in between our NGOs, or is this a tool that I could eventually share with some offices?
That's a great question. 2 great questions. I am not the person to ask about the California work. I think there's a huge need. It's a matter of doing the work that's needed. The guide itself is written to include California and other Western forests. A lot of folks wanted it to focus on Pacific Northwest, but I think it's better that we didn't do that. And so the messages themselves and the graphics are applicable to a California audience for sure. However, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to better communicate the California side of these issues. So I think we should flag that, and Ralph might have something to add. Go for it.
Can you hear me, or am I muted?
Yep, you're good.
It's intended to be nationwide, and we have confirmed on the carbon piece with Mark Harmon that the same fundamental principles of mass balance apply that apply in Oregon. You know, in terms of the carbon density and some of those actual calculations, it's going to be different, of course, in different parts depending on forest types and all. But the overarching number of the overarching findings apply broadly. On the second question of whether to share it with members or people that you trust, I mean, if you trust people, I think in general it's intended to be an internal document, not just handed over. You could judiciously peel out certain parts. I think that's probably the best first step. But if it's someone that's coming to you and saying, we really want to carry your message, then you could hand it to them. I see that that's a plausible. You just have to use your best judgment. The idea is that it's not really intended to be wholesale shared, but of course everything in it is to be used. So in some way, shape, or form, it's all to be shared. That's my thinking at this point, and it's really sort of a trust the user to figure that out.
Thank you, guys. That's super awesome. I know that we have a couple leads right now. Specifically, we have a really great communication going with Bernie Sanders' office and their forest kind of plan in general, how that's going to fit into their climate plan. So that's kind of where I wanted to take this. So that's kind of my takeaway. So
yeah, because that could make a lot of sense to have that conversation. And I've provided a lot of the same information to Earl Blumenauer's office, who just joined with Bernie and AOC to declare a climate emergency. And if they're very open to advancing it and they're looking to you for guidance, then I think it's a great thing to use to educate them.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
And something I will add, feel free to literally copy and paste the content from the guide into your own, like if you want to give them a white paper, there are so many citations at the end. So if they want the science, it's there. In the toolkit, I created this document that has a bunch of the big claims from the messaging guide with all of the science that supports those messages. So it's an even better way to pass it along to them, to draw from it, piece it together in your own white paper, and then hand that to the appropriate member of Congress or whatever.
Right, and they might not want the boring ass white paper thing with all the sites. What they might want is the story of stuff type infographic thing. So, you know, some of them are asking for that. They're like, we got plenty of the scientific sites. Can you give us something else that breaks it down? And Earl even did this. Earl Blumenauer, he made the thing on food. It was like a hand-drawn thing. So, you know, it depends on what they want, and we will be making more things and hopefully working with you, MC, and others to make more things that will be useful to them. So, I mean, we have a pretty good variety starting here.
Next question.
What's next, Alex? So I was going to say to people, is there ways for people to help us distribute this, is one of the questions I had for you. And I think the answer you've given me so far is you're happy to distribute it for people and take names, and you're tracking that, and you've distributed to about 45, 50 people so far. Right?
More,
and,
yeah.
You know, this is kind of the last opportunity for everyone to speak now and forever hold their peace. We're going to make maybe one final set of revisions to this thing. And we've submitted it to the Climate Advocacy Lab, which hopefully they'll distribute it to hundreds and hundreds of people across the United States. And then if people have other ideas on good ways to distribute it and get it into use, then we are definitely very open to that. So, that's kind of the next step, since no one's jumping in to ask a question.
Yeah, go for it, Francis.
So, Alex, I have a question on one of your slides.
Yes.
And it was the slide that talked about public lands as a climate resource. And you mentioned that the Oregon and Washington National Forests store 63% of their total carbon storage capacity.
Yes.
So my question is, basically, that's just national forest, but a huge amount of our land is BLM.
Yes.
And so does any of this assessment include BLM, or do we know what the BLM's carbon resource is?
That's a really good question. And there are estimates from the Forest Service about how much BLM land in Oregon, how much carbon is stored on those lands on average per acre. And it's dramatically less than Forest Service lands. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the way it goes is industrial private land is the least carbon storing. Family forest private lands are the next highest, then state lands, then BLM. So BLM forest lands are not there is a lot of old growth on those lands, those ONC lands. And so I can dig up that, I do have that number somewhere. It's in a Forest Service analysis from a few years ago. But that would be good to include. I think it's an important sub point to that fact about 63% of the carbon storage capacity is that national forest lands are storing more carbon per acre than just about any other public lands, any other lands in the country. And even those lands that are storing more than any others are only storing 63% of their capacity. I think that's a pretty phenomenal fact.
Yes, that is interesting. It's also, the BLM is logging far more. They're doing far more regeneration harvest now than the national forest lands in our area. And we always try and pressure them about the carbon issue. So a few little facts on their lands is handy to have for that purpose.
Yeah, I'll dig up the average carbon stored per acre, and I'll also send you the Forest Service report on where I got that number, that 63% number, because it's a really good overview. It's like one of the reports that they wrote for a public audience. Like they actually had a writer, like someone who's not a scientist, translate the science. And I'll send it to you because it's an awesome report.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anyone want to sneak a question in before we conclude? One more question. Who wants to be the last question or a comment?
Quiet.
Looks like Bob has raised his hand. Let me make sure you're unmuted, Bob. Okay, go for it.
I would like to make a general comment, and I think what you're doing is fantastic. I like the piece that you urged us to read beforehand. I like how you're trying to make, give solutions rather than just raising problems. And I think the idea of going more national and just the Pacific Northwest is the way to do it. And the only comment I would make is that just because of the mechanics of this first run, someone like me, I'm having some difficulty following the slides. I didn't get into the thing earlier. I think upon reflection, I think I will have some additional questions or comments. Is there some forum that can be done to do that beyond the terminus of this call?
That's a great question. So we are recording this now, and I will send out the link to this recording probably tomorrow if I can get the technicalities figured out. So you will be able to go through these slides again, and it will be a lot easier to see. You won't need Zoom. It will be probably on YouTube. And if you do have questions, you can feel free to reach out to any of us presenters, or feel free to join us on July 31st, which is a Wednesday, where we will hear from a few different panelists on similar but different content. And that might be a great time to ask your questions as well. So I will send out details for how to join that call, but that might be a good forum to bring up questions once you've had some time to digest some of this info.
Super, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, unless there are any other last questions, I think we should conclude the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, Alex.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.